Hello everyone and welcome back to Automotive Principles. This class session we are going to talk about automotive engines, their design, and their classifications. So I think before we really get into the nitty-gritty, we should probably know a little bit about the anatomy of an engine. So if we are looking inside of an engine, if you had X-ray goggles looking through an engine block, you might see something that looks like this. Your engine is composed of cylinders, and inside each of these cylinders, we've got our piston, which looks something like this. And this piston is going to move on what you can think of as a set of bicycle pedals. We call that the crankshaft. But our crankshaft acts just like bicycle pedals, which is why your bicycle pedals are attached to a bicycle crank. That's the principle behind that. So our piston is essentially like your leg, piston and rod, which is going to connect our piston to the crank. So our piston is going to act like your legs on a set of bicycle pedals, pushing down the bicycle pedal and moving up, pushing down the bicycle pedal and moving up. Now, without anything else, that's just pretty much an air pump, right? So up on top, and it's going to be hard to see in this picture because we can see a little valve peeking out here. Up on top, we have a cylinder head. And inside that cylinder head, we are going to have valves. And these valves might not look what you might think of as a valve if you're not familiar with engine valves. They look something like this. And I've got two sides, coming in and coming out. So up on top, what's coming in is we call our intake. In our intake, we've got sort of these passageways or ports that are going to feed air into this cylinder, but it's blocked off by a valve. So when this valve gets pushed open, it's going to allow air and sometimes fuel to head into the cylinder. And what we're going to do with that is we are going to close off that valve and we're going to squeeze that air-fuel mixture. We're going to blow it up, and that's essentially going to cause our piston to shove down, just like if you were riding a bicycle. You are taking your leg muscles and you're shoving down each pedal when you're trying to go forward, right? So you can think of your engine kind of like that. Now, at the same time, we've got air coming in. We have to do something with that blown up air when we're done with it. And so we have another valve called an exhaust valve on the other side. So on one side of our cylinder head, we've got an intake. On the other side of our cylinder head, we have an exhaust, which is going to contain passageways to allow air back out. If we don't allow air back out, it's the same as you breathing. So if you try to breathe in and then breathe in again and then breathe in again and breathe in again, you can't breathe in anymore unless you release that air out. And your engine is doing the same thing. If it can't release the air out, it can't breathe in and your engine cannot run. So we need to have an exhaust just as much as we need to have an intake. So when it's time to let go of all of those exhaust gases, we'll open up an exhaust valve and our piston is going to move up and allow all of those exhaust gases out and push all of those exhaust gases out. And then we sort of start the process all over again. While your engine is running, each of these cylinders is in some stage of that process that I just talked about. We're going to talk more about the four-stroke cycle later, but I think it's important to understand when I'm using terms like piston or rod or crankshaft or valve, that you know what's sort of going on. Now, our valves are going to need to get pushed open, and they get pushed open by something called a camshaft. The camshaft is going to have lobes. So if you look sort of at the side there, we've got these egg-shaped lobes on our camshaft. You can see we've got a gear here so we can turn that camshaft. But as our camshaft turns, you can see those lobes are going to move. And if I can hold this all with one hand here, it's going to push down our valve and hold it open. And then we're going to have some other components like springs to sort of spring back our valves. But that's in a nutshell how our engine runs. So now we can sort of have the conversation of, well, what makes engines different? So we have a number of ways that we are going to classify engines. The first is the number of cylinders, and most of us know this, right? when you talk about the engine in terms of 4-cylinder or 8-cylinder. What does that mean? It means how many of these do you have? So in a 4-cylinder, I've got 4 pistons inside of a cylinder that move up and down. In an 8-cylinder, I've got 8 of them. The common ones you guys are going to see are 4 cylinders, 6 cylinders, and 8 cylinders. Of course, there are outliers like 3 cylinders or 12 cylinders or 10 cylinders, depending on the type of vehicle, but those are sort of few and far between. 5 cylinders as well. Why? Why would you make more cylinders in an engine or add more cylinders to an engine? The reason for this is the more legs I have to push down on those bicycle pedals, the more turning or twisting force I'm going to get out of my crankshaft, the bicycle pedals. So it really depends on what it is that you're trying to do. Are you just simply trying to make the car move forward and get as much gas mileage as possible? You may not need as many cylinders. And we're going to get into displacement and all that good stuff a little bit later in this presentation. Let's get into the other classifications like engine size. So you'd think, well, number of cylinders is sort of equal to number or the engine size. Engine size has to do with not only how many cylinders I have, because obviously an 8-cylinder is a larger engine than a 4-cylinder. But some 8 cylinders are larger than other 8 cylinders. Some 4 cylinders are larger than other 4 cylinders. What does that mean when I say larger? I'm not saying the whole engine is actually larger. What I'm saying is your pistons might be larger. And that's going to affect other measurements, such as engine displacement. And that's really what I'm talking about when I say engine size. Think about your engine as one big air pump. It's sucking in air and it's breathing it out. Now there's stuff going on in between, but how much air is it sucking in? If it is capable of sucking in more air, there is more displacement for whatever reason. So maybe your pistons are larger, so the cylinder size, and I'll get into measurements, but that's bore, is larger. Maybe you can think of like having longer legs, or your bicycle pedal stroke is different. I'm trying to use terms that you guys might know. I'm going to get in more into stroke and bore and stuff like that. But for the sake of things right now, just to keep them simple, how far does my piston move? Does it move up and down like this, or does it move up and down like this? Because if it moves up and down like this, that's going to be a larger engine displacement. If my piston diameter is larger, my bore is larger of the cylinder, then I am going to be able to breathe in more air. Your displacement is larger. You can almost think of like your lungs being larger. That would be displacement. So how much volume is that engine going to have, useful volume, is that engine going to have inside? And that's engine size. So we are talking about displacement here. And displacement of an engine is generally going to be measured in either cubic inches or liters. Most of the time, with anything remotely modern, we're talking liters, right? 2.4, 1.8, 1.6, 5.3. Those are all measurements in liters. So when I'm talking about an engine displacement in liters, they might sound like that. Older engines we didn't used to refer to, because this is America and we do everything in inches and miles and stuff like that. So older engines might be classified under CID, which is cubic inch displacement. It's talking about the same thing, it's just not using liters. Instead, it's using cubic inches. So the number is going to be quite a bit larger. So if you hear something like a Chevy 350, or we might be talking about a 454 or a 302 or a 351. Those numbers are referring to the cubic inch displacement of an engine. So 5.3, 350, those are talking about the same thing. They're just using different units of measure to talk about them. Now, smaller engines might be in cc's or cubic centimeters. So that that may sound something different. A lot of motorcycle engines might be using cc's because they're referring to a much smaller engine. Now, there are two terms, there's actually four terms that I'd like to discuss while we're talking about engine size because they get mixed up a lot. So what is the difference between big block and small block and short block and long block? Because those are completely different categories. Short block and long block are one category, and big block and small block are another. So a long block is not the same as a big block. Well, a short block is not the same as a small block. So let's discuss small block versus big block first. They are referring to the actual size of the entire block. And that's one thing I didn't talk about a moment ago when we talked about the engine anatomy. Engine anatomy should also include, we've got these round cylinders that our pistons are moving up and down in. Well, what's holding those cylinders together? What is casing all of this, all of these moving components together? That is our engine block. Now, when we're talking about the engine block, it's going to include our rotating assembly, the piston, the rod, the crankshaft. What we don't see up here are cylinder heads, which has our valve train, and I'll get into that in a moment here. That's our next slide. But everything, our rotating assembly inside of our engine block is going to essentially be either considered a big block or a small block. A big block is a physically larger block than a small block. Now, with certain manufacturers, there's a general rule of thumb. Anything in excess of 400 cubic inches is considered big block, while anything under 400 cubic inches would be considered small block. But that's not necessarily the case for most everything. It's really about size. So I am referring to big block. An example would be a Chevy 454 is considered a big block because the block, the casing of everything, is significantly larger than something like a Chevy small block like a 350, right, where the block itself is in fact smaller if you were to put them side by side. One is also much heavier. So that's the difference between big block and small block. The difference between long block and short block is huge. This is really important, especially if you plan on purchasing any engines in the future. A short block is what I just showed you. It is the block. It is the rotating assembly, your piston, rod, and crankshaft. That's it. It's the bottom half of the engine. What we're missing is the complete top half of the engine. That's going to include our valves, most of the time our camshafts, depending on the type of engine, and what we call our valve train components. We'll get into that when we get into cylinder heads in that presentation next week. So a long block is going to contain the short block and the cylinder heads on top. So a short block is only the bottom half of the engine. A long block is the complete engine, including the cylinder heads on top. So hopefully that makes sense. There's your short block, your long block, and then different between your small block and big block, right? The next way we can classify engines is the way we arrange those cylinders. So many of you are familiar with, say, something like a 4-cylinder engine where they are all in a row, in a line. We call that in line. Very, very common, especially amongst the smaller engines like 4-cylinders, because 4-cylinders is not a very large amount of cylinders, and so they don't take up a lot of space. Now, if we're talking 6 or 8 cylinders, that could get really long, and I might not have space for that. So what a lot of manufacturers would do is as they increase their engine cylinder amount, so say 6 or 8 cylinders, they might go to a V design where I've got half of my cylinders in a row on one side and the other half on another, so it looks like a V. So if it's a 6-cylinder, I'll have 3 on one side and 3 on the other, 6 total. If it's an 8-cylinder, I might have 4 on one side and 4 on the other, total of 8. Obviously 10 cylinders, you'd split them in half. 12 cylinders, you split it in half, and same thing applies. Now, just because I said that 6 and 8 cylinders may come in V designs doesn't mean that they never came in inline designs. Much older designs did have inline 8 cylinders, and they were really long. There were downfalls to that I'm not going to get into, but we don't do that anymore. It just takes up too much real estate, usable real estate for other things, so we don't usually do that. However, 6 cylinders are a lot more doable when it comes to that, so you can find modern 6 cylinders that are in a line or inline. BMW is the prime example. They've been using inline 6 cylinders for a really long time and have been very successful at it. So this is not necessarily any rules based upon how many cylinders there are, because you can get a V design with 4 cylinders. They don't really come in cars because we don't need to shorten up a 4-cylinder, but motorcycles may have a 4-cylinder that is in a V design, something that we won't get into in this class. But a lot of 4 cylinders in vehicles will be inline. Some 6 cylinders are inline modern. Most of your 6 and 8 cylinders are going to come in a V design. But what about other stuff? So we have flat or opposed engines. So all my Subaru people and Porsche people and old Volkswagen people, that's you. That's our pancake engine, or an opposed or a flat engine. And this is where our piston, instead of moving straight up and down, or let's say in a V design where it's sort of moving in a diagonal direction, they're actually completely sideways. This is going to give you the benefit of what a lot of the companies like Subaru and Porsche use this engine design, because it allows a lower center of gravity. So you'll notice those vehicles handle really, really well. Those engines are not necessarily easy to work on. It may require you pulling the engine out to do a set of spark plugs, but there are benefits, pros and cons to each design. Now we've got V and W, or VR and W engines. So down here in your slide, which you guys have on Canvas, we've got the VR style. It's not quite a V. It's sort of much closer together. It'll still have a single crankshaft. The pistons are just sort of offset of each other. We call that a VR design, and Volkswagen used that for quite a while. A W is essentially a V version of the VR. So I've got 2 sort of halves of my block in a V, essentially, but they're VR. So we're sort of offsetting our cylinders on each side. That's not a very common design, but you may come across it. There's a slant style engine where it's like an inline, but it's just sort of tilted. You can think of it as like half of a V style engine. Then we have a radial engine. Radial engines are not used on cars, stock anyways. Radial engines are going to be for sort of aeronautic applications where, and I don't have a picture of it on here, but your radial style engines are going to be pistons that are arranged in a circle. So I've got some pistons that move upside down. I've got some pistons that move sideways. I've got some pistons that move up and down, directly up and down. So, and they're sort of all arranged in a circle, hence the term radial. But those are meant to turn a propeller, not necessarily a transmission. Size-wise, radial just doesn't really work well for cars. So here would be 2 examples of sort of like inline designs. Here's a Honda 4-cylinder. Here's an inline BMW engine in your presentation. Here would be an example of our V-style engine. And then down here is a Subaru where we've got our flat or opposed style engine. Another way that we can classify our engines is by where we put our valves and the camshaft that opens those valves. So we've got 2 blanket terms here on the left. We've got OHV and OHC. It's really critical that you remember these ones, because you will need to understand these in later classes. This is actually, the entire presentation is pretty critical to understand. So if you have any questions, please make sure that you write them down and ask. So OHV stands for overhead valve. And what that means is our valves are up in the upper half of the engine, which we call our cylinder heads. Now, you'd think, well, okay, that's obvious. Aren't all valves in the cylinder head? They didn't used to be. We used to have engines that were called flathead engines, which I have a picture of and I'll show you here in a moment. So when we went to the overhead valve style engine, we had a new name for it, and that's OHV. So I've got my piston moving up and down, right? And I've got my valve in the cylinder head that's going to open and close. That's overhead valve. What that also means is even though my valve is up in the cylinder head, my camshaft that opens the valve is way down here next to my pistons. So we're going to need all kinds of components to transfer movement from my camshaft down here up all the way up here in the cylinder head to open up my valve. So that's overhead valve. And I gave you guys a picture down here in your presentation. So it might be hard to see right here, but if you open it up in Canvas, you should be able to get a better look at this picture. It does include lifters and push rods. So if you ever hear somebody say that an engine is a push rod engine, it means it's overhead valve. That's what it means. That would be the technical term for a push rod engine. Only overhead valve engines use push rods. Now, the other design that it could be besides overhead valve would be overhead cam. Now, in an overhead cam engine, my valves are still in the head. That didn't change. What changed is now that my camshaft is no longer next to the piston inside the block, it's up in the cylinder head moving with my valve and opening my valve from the cylinder head. I don't need push rods because the camshaft is so much closer to my valves. So that would be overhead camshaft, or OHC. With that being said, there's subgenres of overhead camshaft engines. So what you guys might see are stickers that say, especially Honda was known for these stickers that say DOHC, SOHC. So SOHC is single overhead cam, meaning I have one of these camshafts in each cylinder head. If I only have one cylinder head, then I only have one camshaft. If I've got a V-style engine where I have two cylinder heads on each side of the block, I'm going to have one of these in each cylinder head. So that would be a total of two, but there's only one in each head. I hope that makes sense. So that's single overhead cam. Dual overhead cam would be exactly what you would imagine. It is a dual overhead cam or double overhead camshaft design, meaning in each cylinder head I've got two camshafts, two of these. I'll have one for my intake valves and I'll have another for my exhaust valves. So on an inline engine, I have one cylinder head, which means I have two camshafts, one for intake, one for exhaust. On a V-style engine, I'll have two cylinder heads, right? One on each side of my block. So I'm going to have two camshafts in each cylinder head, giving me a total of 4 camshafts. So hopefully that makes sense. But those are how we would classify, say, our valve train components. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned flathead engines. What the heck is a flathead? Flathead engines are a much, much older design where our valves were not in the cylinder head. And I've got a picture right here. So you guys, it's actually large enough you guys could probably see here in the video, but in your presentation, we've got our piston, rod, and crank, our rotating assembly, right? Our bicycle pedals. Here we've got a camshaft. So the camshaft is part of the block, the lower assembly. And up here, you'll notice we actually don't even really have heads. We've got a cover, an engine cover, but we don't need it because our valves, instead of opening up here, they're actually upside down next to the piston. And that camshaft is going to push the valve open and closed. And so you can see I've got intake coming in and I push that valve open, allowing air into my cylinder. And I've got an exhaust valve that once it gets pushed open, we are going to push exhaust out. So our flathead engines don't have, for those of you who are familiar with the term valve cover, they don't have valve covers per se. It's sort of more of an engine cover, and they look quite a bit different. It's a very cool design, much older. There's a reason why we don't use them anymore because it's not the most efficient way for us to do things. So we haven't used them for a very, very, very long time. These don't have a whole lot of longevity like a lot of modern engines do. They run very low oil pressure. They're cool. They're cool. It's sort of a nostalgia thing, but there's really no benefit to a flathead engine. Another way we can classify engines is going to be the type of fuel that they use. So most of this class, we are going to pretty much focus solely on gasoline engines. And that's everything that I kind of talked about. So we pull in air and fuel, we squeeze it, we use a spark plug to ignite the air-fuel mixture, and then we are going to push it all out. Diesels do the same exact thing. They have pistons, rods, crankshaft, they've got intake valves and exhaust valves. Here's the difference. They don't have a spark plug. So when they go to squeeze that air-fuel mixture, they have to squeeze it so tightly that it ignites all on its own. It builds up so much heat just from squeezing it that it ignites. And we call that igniting from compression, or compression ignited engine. So that's how diesels sort of work. So if you've ever heard of glow plugs are not spark plugs. They are like spark plugs in that they assist with combustion, but glow plugs simply get hot and create a hot spot inside the cylinder to assist with that combustion, but only when the engine is cold. When the engine warms up, diesels, you don't need glow plugs. So glow plugs are really used when the engine's closed. Besides that, diesels don't really need anything to help ignite the air-fuel mixture. There are some alternative fuels like CNG, which is compressed natural gas, not clean natural gas like on the sides of buses. Compressed natural gas and ethanol. There's obviously more, but I'm not going to get into them. These are the most common ones you'll probably see. There are downfalls to CNG and ethanol. Both of them together actually have one of the same downfalls, and that is they do not contain the same amount of energy that gasoline or say diesel does. They call those BTUs. And so you actually, even though it is cheaper, some may argue that it's cleaner, you are actually going to end up using more of it. It takes more fuel to get the same reaction. And so I don't see us, I think using CNG will last. Ethanol, here's the downfall of ethanol. Ethanol contains a whole lot more alcohol than gasoline does, which is really, really hard on your fuel system, your fuel injectors, your fuel pump, and all that good stuff. So alcohol is not a great fix for all vehicles. However, there's a lot of benefits performance-wise to ethanol, and we won't get into it in this class per se, but maybe a tune-up class we might get into ethanol a little bit more. CNG also may require that we squeeze the air-fuel mixture a little bit more, so CNG engines may have a higher compression, which we'll get into that, what compression is in a minute. Lastly, the other way that we can classify engine is going to be the number of strokes. Now, what does that even mean? How our engine works, our internal combustion engine works, is based off of what we call either the two-stroke or four-stroke cycle. So we can see here, four-stroke, two-stroke, rotary. And the rotary even still sort of follows the four-stroke process. So let me go ahead, and so does your two-stroke, by the way. We have to have some process where we are intaking air and fuel, another process where we are squeezing that air and fuel, and another process where we are igniting that air and fuel and blowing it up and utilizing that energy. And then the last process is going to be us getting rid of that exhaust gas. Four-stroke, two-stroke, rotary, they all follow that. Diesel, they all follow that same process. The difference is how they do it. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about the four-stroke cycle. I'm not going to get too into the two-stroke cycle because that's really only going to be for motorcycles and old jet skis and stuff like that. And when we're talking motorcycles, not even the motorcycles that you really see on the street, they're more for dirt bikes. So I will at least still include a video so you guys can watch the video on your own because I think it's sort of important to understand the two-stroke sort of process as well. And then I'm also going to give you guys a video on rotary design. So in the next video, we're going to talk all about the 4-stroke cycle process. We'll get a little bit into rotary, and then we'll talk just about some basic engine measurements. So I'll see you in the next video.